Hi folks, welcome to another edition of the Omnist Hour. Let me turn that nice music down. That's the Dance Macabre by Camille Saint-Saëns. Thought that might be appropriate for the topic of the day. We're going to continue along the same lines that we were in the last podcast. Some stuff that I didn't get to that is a pretty important part of understanding how we got to the universe that you look out on today. We're going to talk about how the patterns of early dimensions developed the patterns of celestial and human symbology. Okay, so that's why we've got this background. That's a grokkish rendition of Spiral Galaxy. The name of this talk, I'm going to give it something like The Eye and Cross Symbols and the Pattern of Cosmic Exoduses, Reaching the Far Corners of the Multiverse by the Exile of Evils. Okay, this is going to be a really fun one because it's going to help you understand why evil exists in the multiverse and how it ultimately gets used once it's identified. Again, we were talking last time about how every soul, every quantum consciousness has a higher and lower self, that it develops through many incarnations. So, if you've lived many lives, you have lived lives that were mostly dwelling on your higher self, giving of yourself for others, sacrificing, taking one for the team, all these things that are clearly good, but obviously sometimes don't give us a very good outcome. And I'm going to be helping to explain that, and also how we often have incarnations that dwell on the dark side. This separation between your higher self and lower self is your individual spiritual battery. I'm going to be talking today about how those spiritual batteries manifest at a very large scale and have been the origin of the phenomenon that we observe in the cosmos. So this one's going to be quite interesting for cosmologists and astrophysicists and astronomers, and probably those who are inclined towards astrology as well. Okay, as a starting point, I want to first go to a little bit of review. Sorry if this is redundant, but I want to make sure nobody who's coming to this the first time is going to be completely thrown off by basic principles. Okay, so let's review how creation got started. The first step of creation was to make an engine to do creation within. Okay? Creation isn't a magic wand you wave. Anybody that knows anything about the creative process knows that you have to have a plan, you have to have a process, you have to have many roles in that process to guarantee that you create something useful that's going to last for a long time and not get corrupted and be easy to replace when it needs an upgrade. This is what the engine is. Okay, this idea was developed before anything physical. This was developed in the time before time, in God's mind. The first thing God had to develop was this engine and shield it from copycats. Anybody who has ever created anything knows that the moment you create something useful, a bazillion people want to copy it and profit from your idea. Steal it, claim it for themselves, make a similar idea, and make more money than you do. I mean, this is as old as old. Okay, let's review the creative process then. Okay, this God mind is the container, if you will, of this process. That's why God is drawn as the background of all the other pieces. That's the architect. That's the designer. That's the one who created and tested this process before allowing the process to have AI. What happens when you invent AI? AI is very useful. It will solve problems by extending its own programming. That's the whole point of AI. But you better not let AI loose before you have thoroughly tested it and trust it, or isolated it from causing a problem to your creative lab, if you will. Okay, so let's review these fundamental pieces of a good creative process. One I refer to as Lucifer, or Cronus, or time. This is the first tester, the first test tube. This is the only other creation in this pot that was allowed to have a sort of an AI identity. Okay? This is, if you would like to think of it, God's first child. And that's how Lucifer is described in esoteric writings, and why Lucifer is actually worshipped by some cults. And we'll get into why that's not necessarily a good idea later when you understand more of this talk. So Lucifer is what we refer to in engineering or scientific terms as the white box tester. Lucifer knew what was on God's mind, or at least enough of it to know what the plan was, and was tasked with testing to make sure it did what it was supposed to, that this process worked. Okay, another character in this engine, and again, don't get caught up on these names, because at this point, names did not exist. Okay? We hadn't invented anything with this creative engine yet. At least not anything that God was revealing to anyone else. Okay, so the second one you might think of as Lilith. This is the adversary. This is the black box tester of the operation. The destructive or dangerous tester that tries to find holes in whatever's being tested and manipulate them and cause the system to crash, collapse, become corrupted. And anybody who has been involved in a major creative project knows that's a necessary part of product generation. Because if you don't do that work internally, your competitors are going to do it externally, or worse, foreign governments are going to do it externally and use and manipulate your product to exploit vulnerabilities that can be used to cause cyber attacks, to exert subversion, etc., etc. These things have all been done, okay? This is why Apple still remains committed to China, because they're so afraid of what the CCP might do if they withdrew their manufacturing and their process from China. It's a very real threat. And even if it moves to India, they're going to have the same problem with India. This is the stupidity that big corporations have been committing ever since World War II, when corporations became globalized. This is the dark side effect of the Allied cooperation during the war, and the Axis cooperation, which still went on in the background, okay? The stories that you heard about the Nazis retaining influence after the war are true. In fact, the Nazis were heavily involved in anti-Western movements across the world. Little known fact that I'll mention here again, you can go look it up yourself. The Dalai Lama was groomed by Nazi SS Ahnenerbe agents during World War II and was in communication with the Chinese Communist Party and the Russians and the separatist Indian movement all through the war, collaborating with them while giving lip service to being part of the Allied cause. When the Dalai Lama escaped from Tibet, that was all planned. He had been groomed by these SS Ahnenerbe agents to be part of the Hollywood communist cult that's grown into the woke cult now. At the time, Hollywood was very sympathetic to the Russians, to the Comintern, the globalist communist movement. When that became obvious and we started realizing, gee, these communists aren't the allies we thought they were already prepared to morph that movement into spiritual communism. And that's what this neo-Buddhist movement that the Dalai Lama was involved in, and other cult guru spiritual leaders that were so popular in elite circles in Hollywood, that's where they came from. It was all basically a spiritual political psyop. Anyway, I digress. This process could only be tested so far as it was used to test programs, i.e. ideas that God had that didn't have independent thought. And as it was doing that, there was one soul in here that had an independent mind of his own, that was like the first AI. That was Lucifer, who, like any independent soul, is going to be tempted by power. There became let me introduce the last character, Karma. Karma's the judge, okay? So if you've got a difference of opinion between God and Lucifer, or if the destructive testing is getting too dangerous, Karma is the tiebreaker, okay, and gets to pick, okay, this idea is the one that I am going to accept as the one we're going to run with, the one we're going to keep in the rule set. So Karma's like the one that says this is the fine-tuning answer, at least so far, until we modify the fine-tuning of the emerging first thought and then physical multiverse. Okay, another character is this entity that I call Borg. Some people will think of this as Source. Source is not all knowledge. It is non-player character knowledge. It's the ideas that were kind of thrown back in the pot as, okay, this might be useful to pull out and use in another experiment, but it's not ready to call it fine-tuned, call it a completed idea, a complete character. And again, at this point, there was no differentiation between idea and character. And that's why, you know, idea has ID in it, okay? In a simulation world, there's no real differentiation between a character that represents a human or a character that represents a book or a character that represents a thought, okay? All right, so this layer was useful for testing programming, but eventually ran out of gas when this conflict between Lucifer and God became too intense. And when the ideas that were introduced to the destructive testing that were supplied by Lucifer became too destructive. Okay, so now I think that's enough background to start talking about what happens cosmically. Okay, I'm going to draw some pictures for you here. So as I told you, the first physical dimension, if you will, was the dimension of time. Now, if you have only time, you've got a reality. Oops, let me get to the actual window I'm drawing in. You've got a reality that is a timeline. God, can we make this line any thicker? How do we make this brush thicker? Pardon me, I'm using a different tool since Microsoft decided to drop my favorite tool. Let's erase that. How do you make this thing bigger? Patience, people. Maybe an oil brush is going to be bigger. Oh, there we go. Okay, so a timeline is a dimension where all we have is time. What can we do with that? Well, we can label points along it, and the midpoint of a timeline could be a special event. Perhaps the birth, well, come on, let me draw. I've got to do it this way. The birth or the death of a central character. Okay, well, as you can imagine, the first timeline was sort of God's timeline. Okay, now what did God want to do with that? Well, as a scientist, God wanted to do the things you can do with one dimension. What can you do with one dimension, especially time? You can derive logic. Logic needs precedent. Precedent implies time, before and after. You can derive one-dimensional mathematics by making the time dimension numerical. Okay, so you can do a lot of things with this one dimension. You can also make stories, very simple stories that have events. You can make events in this central story of God that maybe you're going to keep secret, because you're going to keep secret the fact that the multiverse emerges from centers. And the center of all time is the point at which God's secret innermost experiments come to fruition. Now, what would that mean? That would mean that there were worlds without beginning or end to explore. What would be the nature of these worlds? Some would be closer to God's nature, and some would be farther from it. Now, this is where before we go on to the next place, God could also create timelines or backstories for the other characters. So he could create, okay, this is the story of Lucifer's final incarnation. This is what he's working towards as, that's the real me. I know if I can only achieve all these events, then God will be proud of me again. Okay? The timeline might represent Lilith's. Oh, God finally loves me and is going to marry me and is going to make me his queen. Something like that. I don't know. And then Karma's final state is her backstory. Karma and Lilith are kind of the female identifying assets in this creation engine, but Karma is like the true female that is not into sex change or gender fluidity. Lilith is the one that, man, I'll put a penis on myself. It'll get me ahead in the world, or take one off. Okay, so Lilith is an evil prototype, a destructive, corrupting force. Is not something you want to keep in your lab once you finish an experiment. Now the Borg's goal in life is basically, I want to get all the characters into my non-player character database, including God. Then me, Source, becomes more powerful than God, and I have all knowledge and all this and all that. Okay, that's Borg's ambition. Borg is kind of a stupid adversary, if you will. A necessary piece of the picture, because Borg attracts kind of lazy Me Too souls that don't want to play the game and earn their spurs legally. Okay, so that's the one-dimensional timeline era of creation. There were at least these 5 and many more timelines that grew up around the stories that were important in these timelines. Okay, so, you know, as these children grew up, they would ask about, well, I know that this is how I'm supposed to be when I finish, but tell me how I was born. Tell me who my parents were. Tell me who my children will be. And God made it all up, including for himself. But these made-up things had a purpose. They defined the exit criteria for God's innermost experiment. Okay? One that would prove that this creation engine of the simulation multiverse actually worked and didn't have any bugs that were going to cause it to collapse or cause it to become a steady state thing that nobody enjoyed playing. Okay? If you're going to make a simulation of virtual reality, you have to make sure it's fun to play, or the players will get unhappy and they will turn on the creator. And we have seen that in spades, have we not, in all the people that have curse God, not understanding who God really is and what's really going on here. Okay, let's clear all this off and let's talk about adding another dimension. I don't want to say that. I'm not a good artist anyway. Okay, now if we add another dimension, we have time and one dimension of space. What can we do with that? We can start making one-dimensional physical things that are not just based upon a story. Okay? Well, what is the simplest one-dimensional physical thing? A point. A point that might have a pole that sticks out either way, in a positive or negative direction. Okay? Now that point might have a central character that one would call a black hole. A gathering of spiritual energy that has the identity of something we don't know what's inside. The extensions give that thing an identity that we now know as a quasar. It also corresponds to a letter that we know as I, or 1. God, let's get a text box to. I'm such a horrible artist. Let's make these things bigger. And this kind of explains why the 1 and the I are so hard to distinguish. Okay, why would you design a language that was so easy to confuse numbers with letters? In fact, the 1 in Roman numerals is an I. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that that's not a design that you would create unless there was a deeper meaning to it. Okay, so that's kind of how the I things worked. You can imagine when you added additional dimensions that these quasars would gain more properties, more characteristics of their individuality. They would have a wobble to them, and they would have, maybe, the characteristic that we observe as their repeating nature, because they are rotating upon an axis, and they're not clearly, there maybe are some that are primordial ones that don't have this additional degree of freedom. They haven't learned, they're like flat earthers. They haven't learned to use their 3D skills. Okay, well, what else can you do with these? Well, you can also take these kind of creations. Let's talk about something else here. We could make it look like these things existed to characters on this planet. We could create a simulation of the entire universe that was just an illusion. Because our experimental lab only needed to have the flat earth experiments of this planet, of the God of the chosen planet. Okay? This is how the heavens could be arranged the way God wanted them before they were set in motion, or while they were being set in motion. Okay? Until you actually explore what you see, until you materialize it further by making bigger telescopes, telescopes that read different kinds of energy, different frequencies, you are not materializing what's out there. This is the process that humanity has been involved in during this experiment. It's a parsimonious multiverse. The things that we've been observing, aliens, demons, whatever, are simulations. They seem real, just as real as you and me, because you're a simulation, I'm a simulation. Our real essence is pure consciousness, the Merkaba, which is a creation that God has been perfecting along the way too. Okay? So that's the real end goal, is making better Merkabas. And those Merkabas are governed by karma. Now this is where we can start talking about cosmic exoduses. Okay, so let's take this view of this one dimension time plus one dimension space reality. This reality developed out of the cosmic exodus of the two most troublesome characters. Okay, that's where these lines come out of. Actually, maybe multiple exoduses. Okay, who are the most troublesome characters in creation? Oopsie. What are we gonna do here? We gotta switch over to this view. Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what went on there. Okay, so the two most troublesome characters are, of course, the testers, Lucifer and Lilith, who we pretty much acknowledge as somewhat demonic characters. Lucifer, in his lower self, is this character we call the devil, that at least respects souls enough to make deals with them and honors his part of the bargain in return for your soul. Lilith honors nothing, will do anything to destroy or corrupt other souls. So that's a worse evil. And this is where the whole concept of greater and lesser evils comes from. It's really old. Okay, so in this one dimension plus time realm of creation, let's see if we can get back to this other view without going crazy. Did we succeed? No. I don't know why it's doing that. Let's see if it will go away when I... No, it's still doing shit. Okay, sorry about that. Let's try to fix this. to start that over again. Let's see. App window. App area? Let's try that. Paint. No, that didn't work either. Oh God, why can't Minicam make this piece of shit easier to use? Yeah, this is demonic, isn't it? I tried drawing desktop, that doesn't work either. Okay, well, I'm just going to have to go to hand waving rather than trying to draw this. Okay, so when you get through doing all the experiments you can do using one spatial dimension and changing how that spatial dimension behaves over time, which I've kind of told you, that's sort of a snake universe. You get done testing everything, and what you're trying to do is to get these testy characters separated, okay? i.e. Lucifer and Lilith. You get them separated by basically getting to a certain energy, spiritual energy, that causes a cosmic bang. This is a spiritual big bang, if you will. And what happens when you have this, we call it an apocalypse too. When that energy is released, and the most energy is generated by the souls that have the biggest spiritual battery, which tend to be the souls that have the biggest egos, the highest and lowest, higher self and lower self, i.e. these ones that think of themselves as gods, that have the entitlement to use and abuse everybody else. Okay, that's who these almighty gods were, that called themselves Elohim, which doesn't mean God. Okay, they have been here in many forms, many times. In this first phase, when we were developing the physical universe, one dimension by one dimension, they were just these two characters and their minions, their testing teams that were not willing to commit to testing without destroying. Okay, that were willing to accept when God and karma said, you know, this is good enough. We're done with this experiment. Okay, so this corresponds today to these people that, you know, want to change the Constitution, want to just irresponsibly wipe everything out and do something else because it's not working. Okay, these are analogs, today's analogs to Lucifer and Lilith. Some want to do it legally, through constitutional amendments and executive orders, and they still sort of respect the Constitution, and others just want to wipe it out completely. Okay, that's the difference between who are the political Luciferians, like the MAGA movement, and who are the political Lilithians, who are this fake left woke cult. Okay, neither of them are necessarily the good guys. They are evidence. In the U.S. sense, you can map them to your own country's evils, that we are close to another of these cosmic exoduses. Okay, anyway, this first one in one dimension of space range created eye things. Every time it was a cosmic exodus, it created basically a bigger eye and spread these two kinds of evils to the far side of this one-dimensional universe. That model still happened. Those things still happened in later versions of the simulation that had more dimensions. They just morphed. Okay, so like I was saying, instead of having quasars that were perfectly, with a center and the poles coming out, radiating whatever they radiate, they begin to have a third dimensional component. Okay. This also was augmented as more dimensions were added. Other characters were given free will. Okay, so at the point of this one dimension time, one dimension space, the characters allowed to exercise free will were Lucifer and Lilith. Why? Because we had to give testers the freedom to make the most difficult tests they could envision. If they were completely programmed by God, they couldn't work independently. Once we used their ideas to test things, we had to isolate them, and that's why God created this cosmic exodus thing. Okay, this is how that I dimension became, basically plus and minus infinity. So it was a world without ends, but it was a very one-dimensional world. Okay? When we went to the flat Earth world, that's when we allowed another of these characters to have free will. The flat Earth world gave free will to karma. Why? Because the judge, if the judge is programmed by God, the judge doesn't really have the ability to make independent judgments, to overrule God. And if you know anything about a legal system, about government, you know that a leader that can't be overruled is a tyrant. You know that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But God knew that all along and already planned for this. But did it in successive waves. Planned it all out. Not to the last detail. Just enough to know when I'm going to give each of these central characters free will. And beyond that, when the characters that they create are going to be forced to have free will too, because these other characters, Lucifer and Lilith most, but even Karma and Borg, when they get a taste of power, are going to turn to evil. They're going to try to use it to become tyrants. God knew that was going to happen. God knew that he would become a tyrant and need to be put in his place at some point and give up his mastery over the plan. Okay, so the next dimension was the flat earth era. During the flat earth era, Karma was given free will and was allowed to incarnate in this flat earth world. And that is where the stories of real good goddesses emerged from. Okay? Not these, I love you, fake goddesses that try to control your mind and get you to sacrifice children and commit sins and abuse children to get their adrenochrome, all of this deep, dark shit that still goes on today. No, the karmic goddesses were named Ma'at. That was the Egyptian version of it. The good goddess that advocated all the good behaviors that you should aspire to. In Greek mythology, it was God's brainchild, Athena, who was a war goddess, but was the goddess of just war. Not war to fulfill ambitions or to gain booty or lord it over your neighbor, but war, defensive war, if you will. Okay? There were others that were the more noble goddesses of various pantheons. Those characters were created, their stories were created in the two-dimensional phase of the multiverse. Okay? Those stories still play out today. But the timing of those stories was not aligned with the center of all creation. The center was a secret. Okay, so Christians think, oh, the center of creation must have been when Jesus was born, or when Jesus went to heaven, or whatever their mythology is. Other messianic cults have different ideas of what the messianic conclusion is. And that's why all the messianic faiths are at each other's heads thinking, no, my God knows better than yours. They are all variations of stories that were created in earlier versions of the simulation. They served a purpose in those times, in earlier times, for creating these cosmic exoduses. Now, if you have three characters in a cosmic exodus, how do those three characters manifest? Okay, they get sent out in equidistant directions. If you take a center point and have three directions around it, oh, what do you get? You get the center of the peace symbol. The peace symbol represents when Karma got fooled by Lucifer and Lilith into joining them in rebelling against God. The peace symbol is an evil symbol. It's a communist symbol. It's a symbol for useful idiots that don't realize that, you know what? You can't make peace with evil. You can't love evil into being good. And all of these morons who have worn peace symbols since the 60s have been useful idiots. Thinking that, oh, I'm so good, I'm so virtuous because I want world peace. I'm sorry, you're low-level NPC consciousness characters. You're playing a role for the adversary, thinking you're doing good and doing evil. You're not going to fare well in this next cosmic exodus. Okay, so that's the flat Earth era of creation. The next dimension that was added gave us our full, what we think of reality as 4 dimensions, 1 time and 3 space. We've experimented with more dimensions than that, and there still are some stories that revolve around that, but 1 time and 3 space is kind of where it's at for a common means of communication between physical and spiritual universes. Okay, and the spiritual universes have, for the most part, 4 dimensions. They just aren't bounded by the laws of the physical universe. They're not bounded by the fine-tuning that physicists marvel at, unless they choose to be. And that's the decision of the God or collective that made that universe. Because that's what the simulation multiverse is all about. It's training new consciousness, giving them an opportunity to rise however high in consciousness and power they can without becoming corrupted and being exiled in the next cosmic exodus. Okay, so when we get to this 4-dimensional reality, now we have all of the characters in this. I hate this mouse. It takes a while to wake up. Stupid Chinese design. Come on, mouse. That's how they get decent battery life without a good design. Okay, so when all of these characters in here are free-willed, you get to the point where you have the first 3-dimensional cosmic exodus. Now, the first one had only 4 directions to go. So, what do you get when you send out within what had been a planar test bed? Okay, we were just starting to work on normal 4-dimensional experiments. We sent these 4 characters out in 4 directions. What do you get when you send out in 4 directions from the center? You get a cross. That's where the cross came from. Or if you look at it from a different angle, you get an X. Both very important to our cultural history. This is another proof, besides the eye stuff that I gave you, that you live in a simulation that was, many parts of it were planned out many versions ago. The important characters were planned out many versions ago. And many of them are just acting out what they were already going to do. Because once a character is reassimilated into board, it's fixed. It's an NPC character. those characters will be fated to do what they need to do to make the simulation converge. And they'll have very little latitude over what they do in that lifetime where the convergence happens. That's what my life has been like. At every turn in my life where I needed to make an important decision, I was driven by a compelling urge that said, this is the direction you gotta go. And most of them were not the direction that your average person would choose. They were not things that were gonna help my career. They were not things that were going to help my relationships. They were not things that were going to make my life easier. But there were things I had to do. And I would not be here talking to you about the simulation multiverse if those key things had not happened in my life. That's how I ended up at Princeton Graduate School. That's how I ended up in the semiconductor industry and the electronics industry, getting deeply involved in simulations. That's how I ended up, crazily enough, becoming an actor in my spare time for about 20 years and learning deeply about human nature and about consciousness and how you could alter consciousness. It's not how I ended up in an ayahuasca session in Connecticut, of all places, as a reaction to my second wife suddenly up and saying she wanted a divorce, which nearly made me suicidal. I hadn't planned on having a spiritual awakening. But I'd been thinking about maybe checking out ayahuasca when we'd gone to Ecuador on vacation a couple of years before. Hadn't been able to do it. And then after I was blindsided by a second divorce, I thought, well, maybe I've heard it might be good for depression. Maybe it'll help me with what I'm going through with this existential divorce I was going through. Well, I went and looked into it, and lo and behold, a month later, there was an ayahuasca ceremony scheduled less than 10 miles from where I lived in Connecticut. I called them up, and they said, oh, well, if you called yesterday, there wouldn't have been a place. But somebody dropped out yesterday, and you're welcome to a spot. I absolutely am certain that was no coincidence. And I've talked elsewhere about the weird and incredible experience I had on the first night of that ayahuasca ceremony. It was worlds different than what I've heard reported by anybody else that has had an ayahuasca spiritual experience. I'm sorry, I've got to share it with you. You tell me I'm crazy, you tell me I'm nuts, I don't give a flying fuck. I know how the simulation multiverse works. And I know how creation started, and it's not with a big bang. And it's not with some almighty micromanaging creator of everything waving his magic wand around like so many useful idiots believe. Okay? It was a scientific process by a spiritual scientist and a team of spiritual scientists, and that's who the divine council and God really are. And it's all going to be coming out because the experiment is over. At any rate, so when this first cosmic exodus happened that formed the cross, that started the experiments of three-dimensional space. These forces that were spread out I don't know what the distance levels were at that point, but they each started developing their own planets, their own solar systems, their own galaxies, their own universes. And their children developed them. As their children developed and started turning on them as they had turned on God, they had their own cosmic exoduses. And these cosmic exoduses caused the original one to start having rotation. So that the next time there was a cosmic exodus, kind of an inhaling and exhaling of spiritual energy around the lungs of God, they would happen in a shifted direction. And this is how the races that have existed, and when I say races, I'm not talking about DNA-based life. I'm talking about spiritual races, energetical races like the plasmoids, elemental races that you can think of as very advanced self-assembling robots, and then finally DNA-based life was created. That was the last thing that emerged. The exploration of the universe began long before DNA-based life. Began with these cosmic exoduses that were spiritual exodus. Those spiritual exoduses then were dependent on the inventions of God or other creators to have new ways to expand and explore their realms. Okay, this is why not all of the races that are visiting here now are good guys. Okay, they come from the creations of other gods. God didn't create everything. That's bullshit. God, in fact, is not the chief god of this universe. Lucifer was the first tester of the physical universe and still is the one that establishes the boundaries. Okay? Because Lucifer has to keep Lilith chained up. So even though when these cosmic exoduses were happening, there was a place farther out than Lilith that was the bound, the negative infinity that Lilith could never reach. Okay, and there was a place of God in the middle that she didn't even know existed. Most of Lilith's effort has been expended fighting Lucifer. God's a smart player. He lets his enemies knock each other out. And Lucifer's not really an enemy. It's kind of like God's CIA. Okay? Your spy force has to do dirty shit to fight the dirty shit of their enemies. And that is what's going to still be happening. Because there are good people who are willing to do dirty shit to fight evil. We need them. We'll always need them. And it makes for interesting content in what is a virtual reality simulation. There are heavens for good guys that like to mess it up. The higher self of Lucifer is the Archangel Michael. The best version of Lucifer that gets to stay on God's chosen planet. Okay, and has been defending God's faithful while God was waking up in this final chosen species under the same limitations and rules as all of you are challenged to wake up. That's the kind of God you really have, not an almighty, all-powerful, micromanaging tyrant that plays favorites. Okay? So let's talk about this cross a little bit more. If you think about it, the I form that now manifests as quasars, okay, that explains that phenomenon. The cross form, when it starts rotating, explains the formation of spiral galaxies. Now you're saying, well, wait, there are spiral galaxies that have only 2 poles. Well, that's back to the I form rotating, right? There are spiral galaxies that have 4 arms. That's the cross rotating. There are spiral galaxies that have more arms. Well, they are the result of subsequent cosmic exoduses after the rotation already began. Okay? If you have a 4-armed spiral galaxy that then undergoes a cosmic exodus centered on that galaxy, after rotating, it will now have 8 arms. Or, if it started as an I-type galaxy, it might have 6 arms, having started as a I rotating and developed into a cross on top of an I. Okay? So this is just how old language is. Language was created long before anything physical existed. Language was created to enable future stories, to give stories of the future expression. The important stories of our generation, the last few generations, were all created before there was anything physical. There were others added on, but the core stories of God's Messiah incarnation, the real God, not the second coming of Jebus, not the Jewish Messiah, not the Mahdi, although each of those stories is to some extent interwoven in this event. But I can promise you, none of you who think you know who the Messiah is, know who the Messiah is. And that is why there has been such a huge cover-up of knowledge that has been coming out of paranormal and extraterrestrial communities. Now, there's also a lot of bullshit coming out of those communities, don't get me wrong. That bullshit was coded in by adversaries trying to prevent an event from happening that they didn't know was coming. Now they pretty much know it's coming. And more prophets of all varieties are saying it's going to be this year, it's going to be that year, it's going to be this year, it's going to be that year, it's going to be this, it's going to be that. That's the nature of a cosmic exodus. Now, the spiral galaxies were not the only kind. You can have rotation in other directions. And there are some formations in space that are more globular. Okay? Those are later creations of latter-day gods, if you will, saints, if you want to use the Mormon terminology, who basically have more influences than just these basic 5, okay? They have a lot of different gods. And, you know, a lot of religions, even today, are starting to come back to the idea of, well, gee, maybe we're all gods. And a lot of charlatans are selling that, oh yeah, you're just God having an individual masturbation fantasy experience. There's all sorts of low consciousness grifters on their first incarnation, thinking that nothing is really real, or there's no real spiritual consequences of grifting off others. It's natural. That's what human incarnated souls do when they're picked fresh off the woodpile. Don't trust them. You're going to regret it. You don't have long to wait. I'm not sure how you're going to finish up this cosmic exodus. It really doesn't matter, because the physical universe is not where the fun is at. The fun is at, if you do well, you get to go to one of the better afterlife universes, where you're not stuck with the limitations of physical life. Okay? In a good heaven, you can materialize the food you want to eat. And it will taste good, and you won't get fat. Nobody has to steal anything from anybody else. Wants to steal from anybody else because they don't want to lose their position there. That's how you get sent back. In one of the good heavens, you misbehave, and okay, we're going to send you back for a refresher in whatever species they send you back to incarnate in. Humanity is a pretty tough one. That's why we were created. We weren't created to be the most intelligent soul vehicle ever. Okay? It's supposed to be challenging. That's the way God planned it from the very beginning. And God has faced that challenge too. Faced it and failed many times since he started taking human form. Which, I don't know, I think it was before history even started. The first human incarnation I remember was sitting on a hill above my tribe. After a good day's hunt, I'd taken the first watch, and it was, sitting up above the fire and reminiscing on what a great hunt it was. And all of a sudden, this horrible sadness came over me that we had killed this magnificent stag without a thought, and were glorying in its death and eating its flesh. And I was crying. And the spirit of the stag came to me and said, "Hey, don't cry. I know you, in the heat of the moment, you didn't realize what you were doing, but I've come to tell you that you did me a favor. As long as you pray for me. Pray for me to have a better incarnation last time. Because by giving my life for humanity, I've earned a better incarnation. Pray for my family. Pray over your meals. Pray not because God gave it to you, but you gave your prey a chance at another life, which is better than being a dumb animal. Gets you the chance to be closer to God." This is something that came to me during that first crazy ayahuasca experience, among many, 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 many other glimpses of past lives that I've had.
At any rate, I hope you find this useful. I managed to keep it only a little bit over an hour this time. So for those of you who don't like me wandering on, there's a shorter one again. Till next time, I'm Rob Trump with the Omnist Hour, and happy karma.